Hello, everybody, and welcome to our H1B OPT CPT webinar tonight with Customize Your Career. So I wanted to just take a quick second to go over what we're going to cover tonight and let you guys know that we'll save a good deal of time too for the end of the webinar for any questions that you may have, and hopefully I'll be able to answer those for you. This is a topic I'm quite familiar with. I've had lots of experience with it. So I'm hopefully going to be able to help you guys kind of navigate through some misconceptions that can be out there, and hopefully confusion or anything that you might have around the topic. So without further ado, thank you for coming again, and let's just go ahead and get started. All right. Okay. So what we're looking at for tonight is I want to cover CPT, I want to cover OPT, and I want to cover application and timelines for both of those. And then I want to go through the H1B process and the timeline for H1B for anyone who may not be familiar. And I want to go through the H1B current policy updates and predictions based on some things that we've been kind of hearing through the government and some current bills that are open for possibility of incorporation. So I wanted to just kind of clear any of that up, and if anyone has questions on that later, we can talk about it more in depth. And then I also wanted to touch on spring and fall recruitment, because I feel like it does play very heavily, especially into OPT, CPT, and H1B. And then, of course, we'll save the Q&A for the end. All right. So first we have CPT and we have OPT. Let's kind of go through the differences, right? So most people are going to know CPT is for the curricular practical training, which that you can get while you are in school. What I want to talk about a little bit with CPT is when you can use it and how you can use it and who can use it. So CPT can be used by anyone in any school of higher education, so bachelor's degree, master's degree, even PhD, if you are in a school that allows for CPT. Now, most schools do allow for students to use CPT. I have run into the rare occasion where there are some schools that don't allow for CPT. But typically those are one-year master's degree programs. So if you're someone who is looking to maybe go get a master's degree or extend your education and looking toward going to get a master's degree, you're going to want to maybe consider going to a school with a 2-year program, just because you will miss out on a lot of good opportunities with not being able to use that CPT. CPT can be used throughout the school year. So you have two kinds of CPT. You have part-time CPT and you have full-time CPT. What you may have heard already is that if you use a year or 12 months of full-time or of CPT or more than 12 months in any degree that you have, you lose the right to your OPT. What I want everyone to understand is that this is only in regards to full-time CPT. So for most students, that would be when during the summer, when you get a summer internship, and for like 2 to 3 months, you're working 40 hours a week in an internship, right? That is full-time CPT. So that is, for most people, they would never have to worry about ever going beyond 12 months of CPT, full-time CPT, unless you started using CPT as a freshman, which most schools don't allow anyway, and then continue to use 3 months every single summer. So part-time CPT, which you can use whenever you want to, as long as you give notice to your school. Schools take anywhere from 1 week to 2 weeks to typically issue CPT or what would be an updated I-20, which you might be familiar with. And the CPT part-time you can use pretty much any year, all year round. Some schools have regulations where you will have to kind of fall into maybe the quarters or the semesters that your school runs under. So if that's the case, just make sure that you check with your school's international department and just get all of the guidelines for your particular school's usage of CPT. So how to use them. Basically, what you're going to do is all you have to do is get an offer letter. So the offer letter doesn't have to say much. It just needs to say the name of the company, what position, how many hours you're going to work, which is important, and then the location. So other than that, it doesn't need to be anything long and exhaustive, and you will be able to take that and either get CPT or OPT. OPT is what you get after you graduate from each level of college. So if you wanted to come here, get a bachelor's degree, you would get OPT. If you then wanted to go get a master's degree, you could get OPT again after you graduate with your master's, and then so on with your PhD. You cannot get another year of OPT with multiple degrees of the same level, one or the other. So just something to take into consideration. An OPT for most people, for most majors, is going to fall under the 1-year category. OPT here for STEM majors, so that's anything in the science, technology, engineering, or mathematics, that is going to be falling in the 3-year category. And a couple differences to note here: if you fall into a STEM major, you will have to be E-verified after your first year of OPT. So after your first year of OPT is done, you will have to kind of almost like reapply again and submit your documents again and work only for a company that's E-verified, which is a process that's very easy for companies to do through the government. And for the 2nd and 3rd year of that STEM OPT, you will have to make sure that your company goes through that process and that you work for an E-verified company and it is in your field, and that's very important. The first year of OPT and for STEM majors, and then the 1-year OPT, not always does it have to be 100% field compliant or major compliant, even when a lot of schools will say that it has to be. So sometimes I've known students to take like sales positions or other kinds of positions that don't really fall into their major so that they don't miss or they don't like pass that 90-day grace period. So that is something that you can do if you were thinking of that. OPT, if you are, anyone can pretty much use OPT. So you do get OPT. I think that the most important process for OPT that we want to talk about here next is going to be the timeline for OPT. All right, so let's talk about primarily here the OPT timeline. So as I've been working with students, what tends to happen is they're getting close to their graduation date, or maybe they have just recently graduated, and I hear students tell me that they've already or they have just recently applied to get their OPT or their EAD card, okay? So what's important here to remember is that the government is taking anywhere between 3 and 4 months to mail out these OPT or EAD cards. And the EAD card is what you need to be physically in your hand to be able to work anywhere in the US after you graduate, right? So there's no way to get it online. There's no way to get a copy faxed to you or anything like that. It has to be a hard card that gets mailed to you by the USCIS, which is the government that handles all of these things. So what I like to make sure everyone understands is that 60 days before you get ready to graduate, let's say your graduation date, let's take this year. So we have May 2018, which is when a lot of schools graduate. I understand that there's some graduation dates that are in the summer, and then some people may be graduating in the fall or December this year. So let's just take May as an example. If I was graduating in May of 2018, and I wanted to make sure that I would get my OPT and EAD card in time so that I'm not waiting close to the deadline of my 90-day grace period, I would actually want to apply 60 days before my graduation in May. So that's going to be, let's say, the middle of March. For some of you, that might be rather soon, right? So you would want to apply 60 days in advance. When you go to apply for your OPT, you get to pick the date that you want your OPT to start. And that can be anywhere from the day of graduation up to 60 days after you graduate. What I'm going to tell you here is that you want to pick the latest possible date that you can get that OPT and EAD card. Because right now, with everything that's been happening in the government, including, the shutdown that happened earlier this year, everything is aggressively backed up because this wasn't one of the departments that stayed open during the shutdown. So what used to take 2.5 to 3 months to get, which is the EAD card, now takes closer to 4. I've known some students who are still waiting right now, who graduated in December of 2017, and they still have not gotten their EAD card. So you want to play it safe, closer to 4 months. The worst case scenario here with doing the 60 days after graduation is just that you get your EAD card before the actual start date is there on the card, which is not a bad thing to have. So that gives you, but between the time that you apply for your EAD and actually get it, it gives you a good 4 months of time to be looking for a job. And trust me when I say the average person needs about 4 months. Most need 6, and some need 7 or 8 to be able to find a full-time job, especially if you're looking for a position with sponsorship. So the deadline for all of that is really important. And of course, you don't really want to mess with that 90-day category for your grace period, because once you eclipse or go past those 90 days, you're pretty much stuck. And there's nothing that you're really going to be able to do from there. Another thing I want to touch on is the types of employment that you can have. So employment here for use of OPT. You can do part-time work, you can do full-time work, you can even do contract employment, which is just something where someone hires you for a set of time, let's say 6 months, maybe a year, maybe a year and a half, and they're having you work projects when they need you to, but it counts for a placeholder for your OPT. So if you're ever looking for that and you're ever close to your grace period, contract positions can actually be a really good tool to use. Contract positions also are becoming very popular in the US, and especially as more companies become familiar with H1B and how that process works, and they know that STEM majors have 3 years of OPT, they have started to use contract positions as a way to say, hey, come work for us for 6 months to a year on a contract basis, and then we're going to assess how you do. If we really like your performance, then we'll sponsor you next year, okay? So be wary, because sometimes those positions aren't as great as they say they could be, and sometimes they're really good. So I have a student right now that's going through something similar, and she's a data analyst, and she's kind of like getting a lot of contract job offers, and they're real quick to close, but you want to make sure that the company at least has a history of sponsoring before you go forward and just take a contract job, because sometimes they will not actually even consider you for sponsorship, and it's just something they say because they know that they need to get the work done, and they can't or don't want to pay for a full-time employee doing some of those STEM-related major jobs that they have to do. Something to keep in mind with the application for CPT or OPT, really, is your Social Security card. So your Social Security card is what you are going to use. It's the US identification system, so someone knows that you have gone through the workforce at some point in time, right? Social Security cards here are what directly link you to being able to be paid, whether that's for an internship or full-time work or contract work or anything later on. So it's really important that If you are getting CPT like while you're going to school and you find an internship that's going to pay you, or even if you're doing on-campus employment, sometimes people do like a research assistant or a teacher's assistant, things of that nature, and you do get paid by your school for that. Social Security card, you can get one. The earlier you can get one so you don't have to wait around for OPT to get your Social Security card, the better, because it can add an additional 2 to 4 weeks of wait time onto that 4-month period that I already talked about. If you are going to get your OPT for the very first time and you never use CPT and you don't have a Social Security card, that's okay. On the document that you fill out to apply for the OPT, there's an actual box that you check that asks for you or tells you, do you want us to include your Social Security card in this? And you want to say yes to that if you don't already have one, because that way when your OPT and your EAD comes, your Social Security card is included within that, and it cuts that Social Security time down by half. So it's a really good thing to remember. All right. Okay, so let's go into H1B, talk a little bit about process and timeline. So H1B, right? You know, what is it? How does it work? So H1B allows for an international student or just an international worker to come to the US and be able to work for a period of time, pending whether or not the company would want to sponsor them in the future for a green card, right? So it's just a placeholder for hopefully or eventually you being able to get a green card if that's what the company wants or it's what you want. H1B lets you stay for 3-year increments. So when you get approved, if you do get approved for an H1B visa, you get approved for 3 years, not 6. What happens at 3 years is that your company has to repetition for you to get your 3-year extension for a total of 6 years. It is possible that your extension can be denied and your H1B can end at 3 years. So just something to think about, right? Essentially, this is how H1B works. So think of it like what they call it, which is basically a lottery system, right? So they get all of these applications that all rush forward on the first business day of April, and they sort them based on bachelor's degrees and then higher degrees of education, so master's or PhDs. And what they do is they essentially dump all of them into a virtual pool to pick from. So one pool is for bachelor's degrees, and then one is for the higher education. The bachelor degree pool is going to yield 65,000 applications. So they're just going to randomly pick by computer generation 65,000 applications out of the bachelor's degree pool. And then for the master's degree and higher pool, they're going to pick 20,000 applications for a grand total of 85,000, right? Something that's a little known fact. So there's an actual visa called H1B1, all right? So these are H1B visas that are actually set aside for immigrants from certain countries, okay? But what happens is a lot of the times these countries don't actually submit enough to fill that quota. So what can actually happen is that the 85,000 rule is typically over 100,000 applicants, because what they do is they dump all of the leftovers from the previous year that weren't filled, all the slots that weren't filled. They add them into the next year's H1B selection. So instead of 85,000 slots, there's more like 100 to 115,000 slots, which is something that has worked really well for everyone from any other country that isn't like the handful of selected government countries that get the H1B one. So essentially what's going to happen then is they select all those applications, right? And then they move forward to the process of whether or not you get verified or approved for the H1B. So there's approval for the H1B, there's denial for the H1B, and then there's RFE, which is just a request for more evidence. So of course, you know, H1B has certain characteristics to it that they're looking for. It has to require a bachelor's. It can't eliminate U.S. worker, a bunch of other things that it's not super important to get into because that's what your lawyer and your company will handle. But essentially what is happening is if they feel like it doesn't fit one of the prerequisites they're looking for, then that's when they kick back that RFE, right? You have the chance to get RFEs twice. So you could get an RFE, you could respond to it, then you could get an RFE to the response, and then you would submit another petition, right? So sometimes this H1B process, if you get two RFEs, you could be in the pending, right, or like the cap gap extension, you could be in that area for over a year, sometimes up to a year and a half, just waiting around to see if you're going to get approved or denied. I would say a good portion of H1Bs do get approved. So unless the company that you're working for is been an H1B offender in the past, or your job does not match at all what you're actually doing, so if you're like lying about what the work that you're doing, those tend to be the things that will get the rejections the most by the USCIS in the H1B process. The good news here is that pretty much anyone can get an H1B, right? So I don't care, you know, what major you're in or, you know, how much experience you have. Anyone can be, as long as you interview well and you get a company that cares, you can get an H1B. And I've seen people who've gotten it for companies that like no one's ever heard of before, right? It doesn't need to be a big name company for you to be sponsored. And sometimes those companies are looked at with a little more scrutiny because they do use so many people for sponsorship every single year. And so sometimes they're looked at with, you know, like a little more cautiously, like maybe something's going on. So something to think of, something to think about. Another thing to think about for when you're deciding where to work for your sponsorship. So universities and nonprofit organizations, and then government research centers, they are all exempt from the lottery process. So a lot of times companies don't want to go through the lottery process because they're like, I could spend all of this money on you, which is not a lot. It's like $6,000 total in combination between lawyer fees and government fees per person. And they think, I don't want to spend this money and then have the possibility of you not even getting picked and then, you know, getting an H1B. So fair enough, right? But any of those institutions of higher learning, so colleges and universities, and then nonprofit organizations and government research laboratories, they're all exempt. So they don't have to go through the lottery process. They immediately just get picked out, and they take as many of those as they come. So you don't have to worry about like the 85,000 or up. They're still going to pick all of those, and then all you have to do is just wait to see if you get approved or denied or an RFE if you work for one of those companies. Be very careful. So if you're a STEM major, right, you do have the possibility to go through the H1B lottery more than once. And again, this falls into kind of the promise of H1B sponsorship. If I were you, I would get it written into your employment contract as one of the prerequisites for you working there. Be careful again with contract jobs because sometimes they say they'll sponsor you because they know you have 3 years. And so they're like, oh, just wait a year or two and then we'll sponsor you based off how you do. If anyone's asking you to wait longer than a year for sponsorship, then the chances are they're not really going to sponsor you. So start to look elsewhere. Timeline for the lottery. So this is something that's really important as I get students who come to me and ask, oh, like when is the last possible day that I could get, you know, someone to hire me and then still be able to sponsor me for this April? And the answer to that is, it honestly just depends on the company. If they really want to pay the lawyer to put in the extra time, a lawyer could whip together your case within, you know, 4 weeks, because there's processes that you have to go through to even be able to submit. So you have to get an LCA approved by the government. And, we all know anything with the government is going to take an extended amount of time. So you really want to be careful. Like once you kind of get into March territory, it becomes a little bit too late for the possibility of sponsorship for this year. So really give yourself an accurate timeline as you're planning for graduation and when you need to have um, an offer letter in hand with a company that's willing to sponsor you, because the farther away from that deadline you get, the scarier it is for you actually being able to go through. So here's where I want to talk about policy and predictions. So in the previous bill, which is what we just discussed, right? So you've got the 85,000, the 65 for bachelors, the 20 for masters. And essentially what's happening is over the course of the last year, just to give you kind of a U.S. government update, they've gone back and forth on whether they want to increase the amount of money that someone has to make. It's only supposed to be for highly skilled workers. Certain countries abuse it, all of these other things, right? And what I've always told everyone is that at the end of the day, as much as people make fun of Trump and everything that he's done, he's a businessman. So he understands and has actually sponsored people in his past. And he knows what the process is like. And he knows that it is a highly valuable tool, right? He also knows that all of these huge companies that, of course, throw their money around with lobbyists in the government, they are going to be the ones that go to him and say, hey, remember all these millions and millions of dollars that we would donate to your campaign? Well, guess what? Like, we're not going to donate that money if you aren't willing to keep H1B or maybe even relax H1B policy a little bit. So I've always told people not to worry, because at the end of the day, he's a businessman and he knows better, right? So back in January, one of the Republican senators came out with a bill, and this is like the current bill that's up for legislation, right? Keep in mind that even though a bill is in legislation, it does not mean that it's any closer to passing than it was at the stage of inception. So it has to go back and forth between voting and amending and voting and then amending it again before everyone's like, yes, we all agree on this. And then it can go into law. And then even then they have to like slowly roll it out and then pick a date for it to start. So I don't think it's going to happen for this H1B, but it could happen for next year, which is great. So essentially what's happening is the Republican senator came forward and him along with a couple other senators drafted this bill, which is currently being talked about in Congress. And they're going through the conversation of getting rid of the lottery. So essentially they're talking about, we don't want a limit anymore for the bachelors or the masters. If we have more people that are wanting to come and get degrees that Americans won't get, then we need to fill these jobs. Obama himself said the previous year and a half or 2 years ago that right now the U.S. is running at a pace of a deficit of tech-related jobs or STEM-related jobs. So right now there's around 2 million tech jobs that need to be filled, or by the year 2020 there's going to be 2 million tech jobs that need to be filled, and the US will only be able to fill, if they're lucky, 20% of those positions. So that leaves 80% of those positions open for who? They have no choice but to turn to international students that are wanting to work in the US. So lifting that cap will allow for them to be able to receive those H1Bs, get those positions going, and then they'll end up having more money for the economy, right? Which every country wants for themselves. So that is the bill that's being proposed. And then what's happening now is they're kind of just going back and forth between should there not be a cap or should there be a cap. they definitely know they want to raise it. So what I can say is that I am like 90% sure that at least by next year, the 85,000 cap is going to be probably closer to 200,000 or even higher, right? At the minimum. And then they may just do away with the cap in total, because that was the original proposal. So that kind of gives you an overview of the previous bill, the current bill, the political climate, kind of what's going on. And Trump has come forward and said that he understands what this H1B does for the country, and he knows that there's a lack in jobs and Americans that don't want to go into certain degrees, right? And it's true. So you know, at some point in time, like, he is not going to have any other choice but to cave to all these companies that were backing him with money for election, and they need these positions filled in their company. So just a little bit of hope for everyone that maybe was hearing like other things, right? But just wanted to keep you guys up to date on that. So let's kind of go into spring and fall recruitment. So something important here to remember, I want everyone to know that if you miss the so-called spring or fall recruitment, it doesn't mean you don't get a job. These are not the only times for you to be able to get jobs. Fall recruitment really only applies in two ways. And so the first way is a lot of the big four accounting firms, okay? So for fall recruitment for them, a lot of the times they're looking for people in the fall for when they graduate the following May, right? So that is true. But that's pretty much it. So fall recruitment otherwise in your career fairs and everything that you're going through, those career fairs are more for you to gather information on the topics at hand, the different companies, sort of see what positions they have, get to know the companies, get to know the recruiters, build relationships, do some networking, right? And keep those and maintain those relationships through your school years so that you can use those relationships to your advantage once you graduate. It's not all for just getting a job. And spring recruitment's the same way. I personally know two people who just got full-time offers to work for Deloitte. They just got them in January, right? So in no way did they fall into spring recruitment or fall recruitment. And one of the students I was working with, she graduated last May. But ever since these tax cuts happened too with the government, all of these companies are opening tons of positions. Internships for the big four are opening right now for this summer, which they should have filled 2 Decembers ago. So just something to keep in mind, right? Other companies, they're going to open internships and full-time employment all the time. So you could apply for Google right now if you wanted to, or Microsoft if you wanted to. I see positions opening all of the time. There's so many different things that could happen. People could quit, people could get fired. Someone who accepted a position before could say, hey, I have to turn it down, something happened, I can't do it, or they take something else, and all of a sudden a position's open. Or maybe the business is good, the business is booming, and a lot of people want to be able to like create more positions. They're like, okay, well, I thought I just needed to hire like 5 people before for this department. I now need to hire 15. And it happens. As someone who's had previous human resources experience, I've been part of one of those crazy booms where a business deal goes through and your company buys someone, or there's a merger or something happens. And I just got done. I'm like, oh, I just got done hiring all of these financial analysts that we needed for this department. And then some deal goes through and they're like, you need to hire 40 more. So things like that happen all of the time. So always be on the lookout, right? That means that if you want to get H1B, you don't have to worry about like if you missed it during the fall, because that's just a fraction. And I'm talking like 10% or less of all jobs are found during spring and fall recruitment. And one of the most popular times actually is January and February and March. So a lot of companies are going to have fresh budgets. So that's kind of how it works. So you have fiscal quarters. And so any of my finance or accounting majors are going to know what I'm talking about. But for their profit and loss statement, they're going to have fiscal quarters, and all of the budgeting, because hiring is very expensive, towards the end of the year, most companies are on like a true calendar year. So their year starts in January and it ends in December. And they will have fresh open budgets at the beginning of January. So that's when hiring kicks into full force. And just because you submitted an application and you haven't heard from HR and it's only been a week since you applied, it does not mean anything. And I cannot stress that enough. You need to apply a lot, and you need to wait, and you need to be patient. So sometimes I've seen people who've taken jobs and then they get that interview from that dream company and they're stuck. So sometimes you just kind of have to wait. It can take 4, 5, 6 weeks. I've seen it take 8 weeks for someone to hear back from a specific company who's a little bit slower in the recruitment process. So just kind of something for you to keep in mind, especially as you race for OPT, and making sure that you can get into that grace period, which is very, very important here. So when you're thinking about too, like moving your graduation dates, sometimes some of you have a little more flexibility, like, oh, I could either graduate in May or I could graduate in December. For anyone thinking about it, sometimes the best graduation date that you can have is actually December graduation for everything. For getting your EAD card, for getting your OPT, for finding your dream job, all of it. It can be one of the best times to graduate. So just something to keep in mind. So I know we covered a lot, and I'm sure that people have questions, and maybe there's some areas that I like glossed over and you want more detail on, and that's kind of what we're going to be doing now. So anyone who has questions, I would be happy to answer. You can really ask me anything. We're all here to learn from each other. Okay. H1B application. Okay, so graduated December 2016, started your OPT from 2/13/2017. I didn't apply the H1B visa during 2017. My OPT has already expired on 2/13/2018. You're in the grace period now. Opportunity to apply for H1B visas here. Am I legal to stay here and waiting for the result? Okay. Right, not a STEM student. Okay. So, all right, Alice. So what you need to think about here is that you actually technically are illegal if you stay here past that 60-day grace period that you have to leave the country. What I can say is that very rarely are they going to find you. So that's just something to keep in mind. As long as you're like not on payroll getting paid and there's no like electronic trace of you, you should be fine. Because what is a little bit nerve-wracking is possibly leaving the country and then trying to come back, even when you do have that H1B. It can be very difficult to try to get back in. So sometimes it's safer to just stay and kind of like wait it out to see what happens, because they are going to have to, the further away that your H1B is, or that your OPT expiration is, they handle all those cases first. So it's priority in the government. So you would most definitely find out whether you're approved or denied by, I would say, September or October 1st at the latest. So if you can just hang out, and you'll pretty much find out whether or not you're picked from the lottery by end of April to mid-May is kind of the window. So if it gets to mid-May and you haven't been picked yet or notified of your selection to be picked, that you probably aren't getting picked from the lottery at that point. So that way you're kind of really not overstaying too bad, and definitely not in any kind of capacity that you would get like banned from the United States. So I wouldn't worry about that. But if you find out that you get picked and you go through the selection process, it's kind of okay for you to sort of, as long as you're there getting, they're like deciding, it's kind of okay for you to hang around. So I wouldn't worry too much about that, but I would kind of stay off the grid a little bit if I were you. Okay. Graduated December. OPT start on the 19th. Still have not received your EAD card. What date would be my actual starting date? And will these days from February 19th, the day when I received my card, count into my 90 unemployment days? Unfortunately, Raymond, yes. So this is kind of the problem, and what I was talking about earlier is that a lot of students don't understand the timeline it takes for EAD cards to arrive to your door. If your start date is February 19th, that means that you've already started. So as of February 19th, you are in your 90-day grace period. And your EAD card, unfortunately, can show up at really any time it wants to. It doesn't have to show up on time if the government doesn't want it to. I've never seen that happen, but traditionally, like I would say, if you haven't already called and asked them kind of what's going on and if they've mailed it yet or if it's been processed yet, you can find that out by calling the USCIS. And then I would wait, and I would say if you don't get it by at least March 19th or the end of March, you might want to start being a little nervous at that point. But you do have until May, somewhere around May 19th for your 90 days, or maybe a little bit after May 19th. But yeah, that's something to keep in mind, right? Like you're legally able to work, but you legally can't work until you have that EAD card. So it kind of makes the process of trying to find something even harder. So I totally understand what you're going through, and I'm sorry that that's happening to you. You're welcome, Alice. Does anyone else have any questions? EAD applications delayed so much this year. Okay, so typically what's happening here is that the EAD cards, especially with the government shutdown, they are extremely delayed. And like I said earlier, it typically takes anywhere from 2.5 to 3 months to receive your EAD card in the mail after you apply. However, last year it was taking 3 months, and this year it's taking closer to 4. So it's just something to keep in mind. Whatever date you applied, from that date, it's going to take about 4 months for it to get to you. So if you applied in December 15th for your EAD card, you probably, won't be getting it. It's a possibility that you won't get it until close to April. Okay, employer B. Okay, so you're working for employer A in H1B status. Employer B filed an H1B change of employer petition for me. Yes. Can I start working for employer B right away? Yes, you can. So that's one of the really cool things about H1B is that if you ever want to transfer your H1B to a different employer, it's quite easy. Some people are like, oh, it's so hard, and it really is not. It's one of the easiest things. So that transfer process, all they have to do is submit the transfer request, and it takes somewhere between 10 and 14 business days. And as soon as the government gets receipt of that H1B transfer request, then immediately your company's notified, and then that very next day, you're legally able to work at your new company and you can leave your old company. Where this does get a little bit wonky is kind of you being able to give a 2 weeks notice to your previous company. So one of the best things to do is kind of wait for about, like, I would say 5 to 7 business days after you submit the request. Then give a 2 weeks notice to your company, and hopefully by some miracle it happens at the same time where your 2 weeks is fulfilled, you get the notice, and you can literally just start the next day. All right, so I'm going to graduate in May and haven't started applying for OPT yet. So just want to make sure, did you suggest us to select a later OPT start date or even to start the OPT at July 20th? Yes, that is correct. So my suggestion is always to start it as late as possible. So at the end, the last day of that 60-day period, when you can apply, that is when you should be doing it. So that way, let's say July 20th is your start date. So you have all the way through October 20th to be able to find a job, and you're falling right into like that, that like post summer and then pre like fall and even in fall kind of recruitment period. So there tends to be a lot more employers than normal that are going to be hiring, and that's one of the best times. And then also again in like January, February, March, so just something to keep in mind. But it also gives you more time to look, because again, it can be very difficult as you're trying to find a job, and sometimes it's just a timing thing where you could start the application process with a company and you could literally be going through the interview and hiring process for like 3 months just with one company. You could have 4 interviews that you have to go to, and they take a week and a half to 2 weeks between each interview, and you get the next invite. And it really is frustrating. And a lot of students don't understand that or know that. So they think, I graduate, start applying, I'll have an offer in 2 months. That's not how it works. You're looking at 4 months minimum of full-time dedicated job search to find a job. So having as much time as you can possibly have to support your efforts is, I mean, it's going to be everything when it comes to making sure that you can put your OPT somewhere. Can I file an H1B petition on my own? Do I need to be sponsored by an employer? Okay, so this is tricky, right? The way you're wording it is not necessarily correct. So you can't ever sponsor yourself, okay? A company has to sponsor you. What I believe is happening here is if you're saying if you can pay for the sponsorship for yourself, yes. So you have to have a company, and the company's EIN number and all other documents pertaining to the company. A lot of companies, it is part of the really great ability for you to be able to negotiate for H1B sponsorship. So let's say that the company that you're working for, wanting to work for, says, oh, we can offer you this position starting at $65,000 a year, and you go, oh, also I need sponsorship. Because it happens, right? A lot of the times they're going to be like, oh, well, never mind, right? Like, we don't want to deal with that. It's too expensive, or any other number of things. So essentially what will happen here is you can say, okay, well, I know it costs about $5,000 to $6,000 to sponsor. How about I just take a pay cut for the first year? So instead of you paying me $65,000, you pay me $59,000 or $60,000. And then after the first year, my salary goes back up to what it's supposed to be. So therefore, you are kind of technically paying for your sponsorship or sponsoring yourself, but you're not really sponsoring yourself, right? But it's still okay to do. You just want the checks that pay for the government portion of the sponsorship. They have to come from a company checking account. It can't come from your personal checking account. But that's kind of one of the ways through the salary negotiation how you can get around that. Okay, so 2 questions about the lottery system. Currently a master's student, not a STEM. When does the actual lottery process begin, and when should my company start to apply for H1B? Okay, so if your company has not started to apply for H1B, they need to start yesterday, especially for this year, right? especially if you're not a STEM. I would say the lottery process beginning. So the lottery process, the deadline for applications, or the start date for applications is always the first working day of April. So usually what happens is lawyers will FedEx all the applications overnight that night before, so it arrives there at like literally like 5:30 in the morning, the day of that first working day. And the CAP, or the selection process, I mean, it gets filled up rather quickly. So like you definitely want to make sure that you get it in as soon as possible. And they'll start picking like right away. Like it just takes them a while to notify. So the picking process happens right away. They pick those like 85,000, or it ends up being more than 85,000 people right away. And then what happens after that is they go through the very slow selection process of notifying people that they're getting picked. Are they like, either like approved or deferred or denied, right? And I would say most people know with the lottery sometime between the middle of April to the middle of May. So if it's past the middle of May, that's a sign that you may not have gotten picked from the lottery. I just want to make sure I answered your entire question. So I would say if you haven't graduated yet, which is what I'm guessing here, if you haven't graduated yet, you want them to start applying probably about like 3 months before the process begins. So typically most lawyers will want to start on the process of application for H1B either in December of before, right, or January at the latest. And that's just to give them as much time as possible, right? Now, those are for maybe some of the more difficult cases. If you're a case that's really cut and dry, like there's no negotiation around what you're doing and what your major is and anything else, then you can start in January or even as late as early February for that process. So as long as they're starting by that time, you should be okay and everything should be fine. So you mean right now I don't get a job yet, it's too late for me to get into the lottery this year? Raymond, yes, most likely it is too late for you to get into the lottery. I would say I'm 99% sure on that. And that's because your lawyer has to file the petition to get an LCA, which is the starting process. And that can take anywhere from 7 to 10 business days, which means Monday through Friday. So it doesn't count weekends, right? So having that happen, especially that close to the selection process time, as they're like working to try to get out EAD cards still and everything else, because this is all the same department that does EADs, OPT, CPT, H1B, E-Verify. That one department does all of those things. So they're really bogged down by a lot of things that are happening. So if it hasn't happened yet, it's probably not, it's definitely not going to happen this year. Sorry. I don't mean to, spoil it for you, but I also don't want you to have any sort of ill-conceived misconceptions about the possibility of you getting sponsored, or even worse, an employer trying to get you to start working right away saying that they can sponsor you, because the likelihood is very slim. Does the H1B visa require a full-time job? No, it does not. So you can actually get H1B visa for part-time or for full-time employment. And they're very strict about those guidelines. So you have to be working 40 hours a week to require or to file for full-time H1B. And then anything less than 40 hours a week is going into the part-time category. So some companies try to get around the H1B struggle by getting part-time people and applying for them, because then the salary doesn't have to be as high. So that's also something to consider. If you're having a really difficult time trying to find full-time employment, sometimes part-time employment is the way to go. You can still get H1B with part-time, and you can still work up to 39 hours, right? So it's just 1 hour less than you would have worked if you were full-time. So it's better to start applying for OPT as soon as possible, but select the OPT start date as late as possible. Correct. apply 60 days before your graduation date. Choose as close as you can to 60 days after your graduation date. 60 days before, 60 days after. It's the perfect combination, right? So that gives you the exact 4 months that the government is behind on issuing EAD cards. And since most people are going to take at least 4 months to find a job, you should fall right into that perfect ratio. Another thing that I definitely wanted to mention too is that if you're getting ready to graduate this May, for example, if you're starting to apply in like now, like if you're trying to look for jobs now and you're not hearing back, there's a reason, okay? Because jobs in the US, when they post them, they're wanting someone to start within, typically I would say 2 months, and then sometimes that process can take longer, so 3 or 4. So when they get your application and they see, one, that you are going to require sponsorship in the future because you have to answer that, and 2, that your graduation date's like May or June of this year, they look at it and it immediately gets rejected because they're like, this person isn't going to be able to start, right? So when you see postings online, unless it says this job starts June of 2018 or something like that, they want to hire for it soon. So really what that means is that sometimes a lot of you aren't even going to be able to start applying for jobs until around April. So just something to, keep in mind, right? STEM major. How many times can we go through the H1B lottery? All right, so if you're a STEM major, you can go through the H1B lottery 3 times. So you have the 3 years. So you can go the first year, the first April after you graduate, and your second STEM reauthorization, and then the third one, right? And there are times too, people don't get picked in the lottery, and it happens. So that's what's really awesome for STEM majors, is that sometimes they, do get chosen to get sponsored for H1B, but they still don't get picked from the lottery. And so they have no choice but to wait and then try to get sponsored again next year. And it happens, and it's okay. I would say I've never met someone who has needed more than 3 years to get sponsorship. They traditionally get picked at least by their second time going through the lottery. Emily, what's the possibility for us to get approved after 1 or 2 RFEs? I have heard some of my friends finally get rejected after 1 or 2 RFEs. What are some possible reasons? There's so much that goes into an RFE and why you get one, why you get rejected. So let me try to cover all of them. So the people who work at the USCIS, some of them are high school graduates. Okay, so just let that sink in for a while. Sometimes the fate of you being able to get picked from the H1B falls into the hands of an 18-year-old. Okay, what that means is that some of the people, like those are typically the ones that just get passed or denied right away, because a lot of the times that person doesn't really know what they're doing. And then, there's times with the RFE where they are actually really looking at it and they're like, oh, something here with what your lawyer's saying or how they're trying to justify it. I just feel like I need more information. That is really what the first RFE is for. Typically, like your lawyer didn't do a good job explaining, or the company is really trying to stretch your major into making it fit for the position that they're paying you for. Other than that, if you get a second RFE, that typically is like, I'm kind of feeling like this isn't a legit job. So when that happens, it's usually an agent that knows what they're doing. And so they don't just stamp approved or denied on it, but they actually really fully consider. And there's something about it that just isn't right. So the best thing that you can do is try to find a job that actually matches your field, or a portion of it, at least 50% or more, matches your field. As long as that is true, you should never, ever, ever have a problem getting your H1B approved or worrying about RFEs. So if the lawyer does a good job and your job is a match to what you're applying for, then it shouldn't really be a problem. Okay, so the lottery masters only get 20,000. I've heard from people that the lottery system is based on the percentage of the application pool. Okay, so right, a lottery is based on percentages, so that's just something to remember. Now, let me maybe just like clarify this real quick. So what happens is if you have a master's degree or any higher education, something over a bachelor's, you actually get to go through twice. So what happens is first you go through the master's pool, so all the masters and PhDs get dumped in together. They pick out 20,000. Then anyone who didn't get picked gets dumped into the bachelor's pool. So they already had the 60, like the however many bachelors in there, and then they dump all of the masters and PhD rejects that didn't get picked into the bachelor's pool, and then all the masters and higher students have a chance to get picked, possibly get picked again. So what this means for master students is that, or anyone higher, you have a like almost double the probability of getting picked. And that's kind of what you'll see with a lot of companies is that sometimes if you don't have that master's degree, they're less likely to sponsor you because they're like, oh, the chances of you getting picked are really slim, right? Not really slim, but slimmer than if you had a master's degree. So most companies really prefer you to have at least a master's for H1B, and that's not always the case, right? So don't quote me on it because I know plenty of people who have a bachelor's degree, they have an H1B. So it's just kind of something to think about. And if anyone has questions, they don't necessarily need to, if it's about something other than H1B, like please feel free to ask your questions. That's what I'm here for. So it could really be about like job search in general, or if you have questions about like what HR people think or feel about things or how the application process works or how they choose the people that they choose, any of those questions are totally fine. Oh no. Okay, yeah. So yeah, because you can search and it says received. So that means they have it, but it doesn't mean it's not mailed yet. So, okay. I mean, you should get it before your 90-day period. So I would just keep looking and try to find something and then make sure that your company that you get hired by is just okay with you kind of having an ambiguous start date, because that's kind of what's going to happen. But you can still make it work because I've seen people do it. Anybody else? Questions? It's okay if you don't. All right. I think that's probably what we'll do then is oh wait, I got one more. Okay, we'll have this be the last one. Is graduating in July a good time for OPT or H1B timeline? Or do you still recommend December? My number one recommendation is always December. Like, quite honestly, I mean, it's when you really have the most jobs available to you is January, February, March, and even sometimes a little bit in April. July is not a bad time. I would say that would be, if I had to choose, December would be the best, and then it would be like July or June, and then it would be May. The graduation dates that are not great, because I've seen some of these before, are like, I've seen graduation dates in October and November, which are quite odd. And that puts you in this really weird time frame of like, because there's like almost no hiring that happens during November and December. So you lose like an entire month and a half off of your ability to find a job, and then you barely make it into that like January, February, March time frame. So that's kind of like the one date that I caution people to stay away from. Okay, so I'll have this be the last question. Okay, so could you explain a little bit on contract jobs? Yes, contract jobs kind of look like this. Otherwise, for all my accounting students, they known as 1099 type jobs, right? So those are the jobs where I'm paying you for a service provided. So you're not technically on my payroll per se, like you're not on a W-2 form, but more so I'm saying like, here's a job that I need you to do. So let's say I need you to make a web page, right? I'm like, hey, I need you to make a web page. Here's my ideas. Here's everything that I need. I need you to be able to do it within 4 weeks, and I'll pay you 30 hours a week for each of those weeks. So you have a guaranteed set number of hours, set days, but there's no set times. Like you don't necessarily have to work from like 9 to 5. You kind of get to choose what days or hours you want to work, which can be nice for some people. You don't necessarily have to go into the office, nor can anyone tell you you have to go into the office. You can work from home. Sometimes, a lot of the times, in a contract job. A contract employer, a contract agreement, they can't tell you what to do physically outside of saying, here's what I need, here's when I need it by, here's how much time I'm giving you. So then you could finish the job in a week if you wanted to, if you were so inclined, and have it done and sit on it, and then take a paid 3-week vacation if you wanted to. So that is kind of one of the perks of contract employment. But contract can end at any time. So your employer could fire you for any reason, or they could just be like, we don't want you anymore. You could say, hey, I don't want to work for you anymore. Bye. You don't have to give a 2-week notice. You don't have to give any kind of notice if you don't want to. You can just say, see ya, and that can be the end of it. So it's fun for the possibility of turning into full-time, or if you just want to generate some experience for your resume in order to make your resume look better for when you're trying to get full-time employment. But it can also be kind of dangerous because you can just be let go without any notice at all. So just something to be wary of a little bit as you work with contract employment. Be careful, research the company, see if they actually do sponsor. MyVisaJobs.com is one of the best places that you can go to look. It tells you how many green cards and H1B visas every company has ever sponsored, ever, right? And then it tells you how many are denied. So if a company says that they're going to be giving you sponsorship, but then you see that they've sponsored 20 people in the past, and 15 of them have been denied, that's a red flag, right? I don't want to work for that company because most likely what I'm going to be doing is not what I'm really going to be doing, or maybe they're a violator. They were a violator of the policy in the past, so the chances are really high that I could get denied. So just something for you guys to use for the future. But we'll cut it off there. So I'm sure that you guys are all in contact with at least somebody who works for CYC. So please, if you have any questions, additional questions that you didn't want to say here, that's totally fine. Feel free to reach out to them. Feel free to reach out to me if you would like. I would love to answer more questions. Thank you again for coming. I know that it's a little bit late at night, especially for my East Coast people. And I look forward to seeing you all again at some point in the future. Take care. Bye.